There's socialism, socialist insanity, and then there's Jeremy Corbyn. After asking for sex segregation in trains, after praising Hamas, and after praising the ruthless dictator and criminal Fidel Castro, now Corbyn wants a Castro policy for Britain. Let's explore. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. There are a few things in life that are more insane than economic socialism. This is particularly true in the case of those who genuinely think it's a good idea, as opposed to those who are simply economically illiterate who can at least be forgiven for their ignorance. One such pathological case is Jeremy Corbyn of the Labour Party in Britain, a man who would make Ceausescu blush and arguably would give Stalin a pause for thought, since none of these latter dictators ever came up with such an idea. Under normal circumstances, of mental sanity that is, one would think again when realizing he just proposed something to the left of Stalin, but not Jeremy Corbyn. No. Jeremy Corbyn marches on with lunacy after lunacy. Now, with that said, his lunacy is worth paying some attention to because he has, in addition to his lovers, who aren't very many, an accompanying choir of yes but men. You know them, the people who will concede that his policy ideas aren't particularly great, but that he's somehow having a point nonetheless. So, without further ado, let's read from The Guardian. Jeremy Corbyn calls for a maximum wage law. And goes like this. It's a long article, so I'll only read portions of it. Quote, Jeremy Corbyn has called for a maximum wage for the highest earners, saying he fears Brexit will see the UK become a grossly unequal bargain basement economy. The Labour leader would not give specific figures, but said radical action was needed to address inequality. I would like there to be some kind of high earnings cap, quite honestly, he told BBC Radio 4's Today program on Tuesday. When asked at what level the cap should be set, he replied, I can't put a figure on it and I don't want to at the moment. The point I'm trying to make is that we have the worst levels of income disparity of most of the OECD countries. It is getting worse and corporate taxation is part of it. If we want to live in a more egalitarian society and fund our public services, we cannot go on creating worse levels of inequality. Corbyn, who earns about £138,000 a year, later told Sky News he anticipated any maximum wage would be somewhat higher than that. I think the salaries paid to some footballers are simply ridiculous. Some salaries to very high-earning top executives are utterly ridiculous. Why would someone need to earn more than £50 million a year? The Labour leader, who is an Arsenal fan, said he thought his team's manager, Arsène Wenger, would probably like it very much indeed. He'd probably like to be a maximum wage cap on the whole of the Premier League. Corbyn said he believed taxpayers would ultimately benefit from job creation as a result of lower executive pay. They would have less of their enormous pay levels and more would go back into the company and our society as a whole, he said. Economic development does benefit the taxpayer because more people work and get jobs and pay taxes. It's something we're looking at and learning from others, close quote. In a speech later on Tuesday, Corbyn will claim that Britain can be better off outside the EU and insist that Labour has no principled objection to ending the free movement of European workers in the United Kingdom. However, his preference for a maximum income law will overshadow the announcements for the party's policy on Brexit, even though Corbyn had expressed his view on the issue before during his leadership campaign. Quote, it's a kind of a philosophical question, really. There ought to be a maximum wage. The levels of inequality in Britain are getting worse, he told the Herald in 2015. Corbyn stressed he was not announcing a specific policy on a law to limit income, but said he had got a view on it. Pressed again, he said, I would like to see a maximum earnings limit, quite honestly, because I think that would be a fairer thing to do. Because we cannot set ourselves up as being a grossly unequal bargain-based economy on the shores of Europe. We have to be something that is more egalitarian and that gives real opportunities to everybody and properly funds our public services. Close quote. I think that's enough. Now, first of all, just because you claim something is more egalitarian, that doesn't mean it actually is, and more importantly, it doesn't mean it's fundamentally a good thing. In fact, quite the opposite is true. Equal is unfair and an absolute disaster. The reason being, of course, the absolute fact that people are not equal. They never have been, are not, and there is no reason to believe they will ever be. Now, following Corbyn's logic, it is unfair that I only have about 3,000 subscribers, whilst Bill Whittle has 83,000 subscribers. We both do conservative commentary, and I probably work more per video than him. So why not some egalitarianism here? Now, of course, those mean, nasty Tory capitalists would be quick to point out that Bill has been doing this for far more time than I did, has better connections than I do, has had more time to save up capital to invest in better equipment, and is, at least in some respects, more talented than I am. So, of course, he deserves better revenue, higher viewership, and more subscribers. But you see, this applies everywhere, not just in terms of success on YouTube. YouTube is a microcosm of how a wider, sparsely regulated market would actually work. I mean, what are the rules on YouTube? Don't steal other people's content, don't post porn, and that's really pretty much it. Now, sure, for monetization there are other rules as well, but by and large, everyone is allowed to rise and fall depending on how many people are willing to give them their resources in exchange for their output. And by resources, I don't mean just shekels, but also time. Watching videos takes time, which is the ultimate finite resource and the reason why no post-scarcity nonsensical lefty utopia could ever exist. But anyway, I'm glad that Corbyn mentioned football, which at least in Europe is another great example of how an unfettered market actually works and how its very existence refutes any socialist nonsense. I mean, Corbyn asks rhetorically, why would someone need to earn more than £50 million a year, and asserts that Arsène Wenger, quote, would probably like it very much indeed. He'd probably like there to be a maximum wage cap on the whole of the Premier League, close quote. Except that's not how reality works, and here's why. In football, the pay of the players is established via market means. There is only one Lionel Messi, one Cristiano Ronaldo, one Santi Cazorla, one Christian Eriksen, and so on and so forth. And in football, it works just like in upper management companies. You have to make yourself irreplaceable or very close to irreplaceable. The more you make yourself irreplaceable, the more your pay and your market value as a football player increases. Now, in spite of what many might be tempted to think, football is 95% science, hard work and skill, and 5% luck. What this means is that there is a direct correlation, an almost impeccable correlation between big money and big wins on the pitch. Yeah, sure, sometimes surprises happen, like in 2009 when tiny Russian club Rubin Kazan successfully defended a 0-0 score at home against Barcelona and then go on Camp Nou and miraculously beat the Catalans 2-1 and then repeat the performance 1 year later and defend a 1-1 in Spain and win 2-0 home against Barcelona. But that is the exception. The rule is that those who spend more win more. Gone are the days when a semi-amateur squad of enthusiastic 19-year-olds could go all the way and win the European Championships Cup. It just doesn't work that way anymore. Now, if we are to apply Corbyn's rule and cap the pay of Premier League players, we can safely predict what will happen. Let's say you put the cap at, let's say, £5 million. Well, that means virtually all outstanding players in the Premier League immediately move somewhere else. For instance, Paul Pogba from Manchester United is paid £292,000 per week. That's over £151 million per year before taxes. Do you think this guy would be immensely happy to take a 95% plus wage cut in the name of fairness? If you do, you might be a socialist. Zlatan Ibrahimovic, the Bosnia-born Swede, earns £250,000 per week. This guy would be the first to leave in the case of such a rule. He left France in a blink of an eye when François Hollande cracked down on football players' earnings, and he didn't leave all by himself, but alongside with any other meaningful player in that country. A $5 million per year cap would reduce the Premier League to the level of Portugal, which hasn't given a relevant squad for Europe since Jose Mourinho made miracles back in 2004. A $1 million per year cap would reduce the Premier League to the level of Austria or Romania or maybe Poland, leagues that haven't given anything of relevance past the group stages for a decade now. And the thing is that such a move would not even benefit the dear causes of socialists. Capping the income of players would incentivize Manchester United to open its own club in China and then broadcast from there. Man United already makes a huge revenue from selling t-shirts in Asia. Why not take the Premier League altogether there? You think it cannot happen? If you think so, you might be a socialist. I would recommend those who are more fair-minded to look into clubs such as Ajax, Cape Town. And no, it's not a coincidence. Bolton also owns a small club in Africa as well. Basically, what I'm trying to say here is that capping the income of players would not make the clubs pay more taxes, create more jobs, invest more in infrastructure and whatnot. It will, however, incentivize the phenomenon known in economics as capital flight. Now, I explained using football examples because this is what The Guardian and Jeremy Corbyn provided as an example, but this rationale works on any other branch of business. It is, however, most obvious in football. In football, it is perfectly possible to be a young poor dude from rural Brazil or rural Congo that ends up making £100 million a year for several years. Because another aspect that is rather unique to sports is the fact that one's career is not really that long. Yes, Ibrahimovic makes a crap ton of money, but he's 35. He'll make zero by 2025. This season, and perhaps the next one too, are among the last seasons for him to cash in. He could become a coach, but there aren't very many cases of fantastic players becoming good coaches or managers. And that's a complicated topic best left for another day. Now, although this is getting a little bit long, let's take a stab at the core argument put forth by Corbyn as well, that it is fundamentally fair to fight inequality by capping incomes. Now, in this argument, there are essentially two separate arguments. One, that inequality is inherently bad, and that fairness is measured in how equal things are. Now, let's take it one step at a time. First of all, inequality is neither good nor bad. Inequality is just a measure of something, and inequality is always relative to something else. In other words, when something is unequal, one must ask, unequal compared to what? Is it a good thing that income inequality is unheard of in Cuba? Not if you ask the Cubans, for sure. This kind of policy was explained impeccably by Margaret Thatcher decades ago. The likes of Corbyn would rather have the poor poorer, provided that the rich are less rich.
Mr. Speaker, all levels of income are better off than they were in 1979. But what the honourable member is saying is that he would rather the poor were poorer, provided the rich were less rich. That way you will never create the wealth for better social services as we have. And I think that the honourable gentleman knows that I have the same contempt for his socialist policies as the people of East Europe who have experienced it have it for theirs. I must have hit the right nail on the head when I pointed out that the logic of those policies are they'd rather have the poor poorer. Once they start to talk about the gap, they'd rather the gap were that. Down here. That. Not that. But that. smaller, they'd rather have the poor poorer. You do not create wealth and opportunity that way. You do not create a property-owning democracy that way.
In other words, regardless of whatever you may think about fighting inequality, and regardless of whether you think this is a good thing or not, the fact of the matter is that the only way you can do that is by making everyone worse off. And again, inequality is relative in and of itself. Yes, there is a huge inequality in the United States, in Britain, and really most of Europe except Slovenia and Luxembourg. In fact, you will be hard-pressed to find a country with a low level of inequality that is both decent in standard of living and larger population-wise than 10 million inhabitants. But not all inequalities are created equal. The inequality in China, where those living in the special economic zones, where capitalism is allowed to function a little bit, enjoy a first world standard of living, whereas those living in the provinces where Beijing decided not to allow them to prosper are still stuck in the 17th century. That inequality is not the same as the inequality in the United States, where the poorest 2% of Americans still enjoy a much higher standard of living than 90% of the planet. Or let me put it this way, it is better to be poor in Great Britain than to be rich in Burundi or Malawi. The fact that Zlatan Ibrahimovic makes £130 million a year doesn't affect you negatively in any way, shape or form. If anything, it affects you positively, since his income taxes pay for your public services to a much higher and greater extent than you will ever be able to pay for them. So a bit of gratitude would be in order. But then again, Jeremy Corbyn is not in the business of sanity, but in the business of stoking the politics of envy. The only good news here is that Labour is not likely to be elected in power anytime soon. The bad news is that if such lunacy gains ground anywhere, not just in Britain, we will have to, yet again, see the rise of misery. Because too many people seem to learn absolutely nothing from history. And don't kid yourselves, this kind of mentality is very widespread. An incredible amount of people genuinely think this lunacy is a good idea. A progressive recently told me that it doesn't matter that it didn't work in the past. Why should the future be determined by the past? Asked the progressive. And you can see this mentality at play in this article's comment section as well. Now, speaking of which, I'll publish soon an entire video about comment sections and why they matter. But anyway, this mentality that we can somehow be smarter than history and we can succeed where literally everyone else failed, this is a mentality that is sadly very, very prevalent. The only difference between Corbyn and your average Labour fan is that Corbyn is being honest about his goals. Jeremy Corbyn is not too radical for Labour. Jeremy Corbyn is what the Labour Party would be if it were honest. Naked politics of envy, open advocacy for theft, and extreme hatred of the most productive members of the society, that is what leftism is. And that is why I hope Corbyn serves as the president for Labour until his death. And I'm not joking. He makes the left honest, which is absolutely fantastic in and of itself, for if leftists were to always be honest like Jeremy is, there would never be leftism at all in a generation or two. And with all of that being said, thank you for watching, thank you for your continuous and generous support, and I'll see you around on Freedom Alternative.